Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're on the West Coast. My name is Daniel DiOrio, and I'm a policy specialist on the elections team here at the National Conference of State Legislatures. Thank you for joining us today for Spring Cleaning Your Voter List, the legislative role. It's been a wild election season so far, with many twists and turns keeping legislators and election officials busy on a variety of aspects of election systems. One of the more recent stories involved nearly 125,000 voters who were removed from the voter rolls in Brooklyn prior to New York State's presidential primary in early April. In Ohio, the American Civil Liberties Union has sued Secretary of State John Husted over the process of removing voters who have not voted in 3 successive federal elections and local elections. Critics have called these actions purges, but most admit that it is part of the routine process of voter list maintenance that local election officials perform to ensure that the information on voter rolls is accurate prior to a big election. For this webinar, we will hear from 3 experts regarding voter list maintenance. First, Sam Dearheimer from the Pew Charitable Trusts will discuss how accurate voter lists are currently, what problems can arise from inaccurate records, and how federal law helps to guide state decisions. Next, John Lindback from the Electronic Registration Information Center will discuss how states can cooperate to maintain voter lists for an increasingly mobile population. Lastly, Wendy Underhill, Program Director for Elections at NCSL, will discuss recent legislative actions and other options that may be available for legislators to consider. For this webinar, you can ask a question at any time by entering it into the box located at the lower left-hand side of the screen. We have reserved approximately 10 minutes for questions at the end of the webinar. The presentation can be downloaded at any time during the presentation. Simply click on the media library icon located in the upper right-hand corner. It looks like a yellow piece of paper with a blue bar graph in front of it. There are also additional resources from both the Pew Charitable Trusts and ERIC for download in the media library. And now I will turn it over to Mr. Sam Dearheimer of the Pew Charitable Trusts. Sam.
Hi. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are in the country. This is Sam Dearheimer with the Pew Charitable Trust. And I want to say first thank you to NCSL, specifically to Dan and Wendy, for putting this webinar together. I'm grateful to be a part of this and to discuss a topic that is as relevant as voter registration list maintenance as we lurch forward into a particularly intriguing election season. We've already seen countless stories about how the accuracy of state voter rolls can have an effect on election day. So I'm going to do a real quick top-line review of federal laws and guidelines on voter registration list maintenance, do a quick discussion of the benefits of clean voter rolls and good list maintenance programs, and then finally a look at some of the tools states can employ to keep voter rolls accurate, to keep them up to date so that we don't see some of those problems that we've been seeing in the news lately. So a brief look at some of the federal laws and guidelines that help state election officials maintain clean and accurate rolls. And I am going to just kind of do a brief overview. This isn't going to be a deep dive. We could probably spend the entire length of this webinar diving into the specific regulations and text of federal guidelines, but I'm going to try to just do a little table setting and give us all enough tools so that we can kind of understand what we're talking about for the rest of the webinar. So the guiding federal law is probably the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, the NVRA, which is pretty commonly referred to as motor voter due to Section 5 of the NVRA that opened up voter registration at motor vehicles agencies. But the NVRA also covers list maintenance, and it does require states to conduct a general program that makes reasonable efforts to get ineligible voters off the voter rolls. Now, some of the gray area is reasonable is never defined. And the NVRA covers several different kinds of voter statuses. So specifically, the NVRA talks about voters who may be ineligible due to death and voters who may be ineligible due to changing of residence. However, there are restrictions on when states can remove voters from voter lists. So specifically, states shall not remove any voter on the grounds that they have changed residence unless that voter confirms in writing that they have in fact changed residence, or that the state has issued a notice to the voter and that voter does not respond and then does not vote in 2 federal general election cycles. Now, the actual language of the NVRA says does not vote or appear to have voted. So really, election officials are looking for any kind of engagement of voting activity. Additionally, that notice sent to voters must contain a postage, prepaid, and pre-addressed return card. So voters must be given an opportunity to correct the inaccuracy in their voter roll, and inaccuracy just is probably a no longer valid or no longer accurate residence. So change of residence is handled a little differently than death. Now, states also have their own rules and regulations covering voter registration list maintenance. States have a vested interest in finding duplicate voter registrations. States have a vested interest in finding individuals with felony status who are no longer eligible to vote. States may also have an interest in finding individuals deemed mentally incompetent. These are all issues where states may want to find registrations for voters who are no longer eligible and remove them, but those are not as covered as directly under the NVRA as the death of a resident, or as you see on the slide up on the webinar right now, change of residence. So, moving forward. There's also the Help America Vote Act, commonly referred to as HAVA. Again, HAVA also places a voter registration list maintenance requirement on states, again, requiring reasonable efforts that is also not defined, leaving a little bit of confusion. But it does also require states ensure that safeguards are put in place to ensure that eligible voters are not removed accidentally. And of course, any voter registration list maintenance must be conducted in accordance with the NVRA. HAVA also requires that the chief election official coordinate with the chief motor vehicle agency official in a state to match relevant information for voter registration. It also requires that the chief motor vehicle agency official cooperate with Social Security Administration officials so that they can learn of individuals who have died. Again, there is some gray area. There is a lack of definition in what to do once that match has occurred. So HAVA requires a match, but doesn't provide instructions on how to perform that match or really how to process the resulting data. A little later in this webinar, John Lindbeck will be speaking, who can go into much greater detail than I can on what it's like to be an election official and have these requirements on top of you. John was a state election official for many years and had to implement these laws himself. So he'll be, if you have questions, he'll be a great resource there. So in addition to federal law, as I mentioned, all states have their own laws, regulations, and practice that may go above and beyond federal law, but that's kind of where we're starting from. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits and why states want to engage in voter registration list maintenance, right? An accurate voter roll in a state is the key to a healthy democracy. If you do not have accurate voter records, you can run into a slew of problems that I'm going to detail right now. So first is just accuracy of the voter rolls. This is something we at Pew have looked into for the last several years. And what we've found is that in the U.S., many voter rolls are rife with inaccuracies and no longer valid registrations. So we did some research back in 2012 and found that 1 in 8 records nationally is either no longer valid or contains an inaccurate data point that could prevent that voter from accurately casting a ballot. More than 1.8 million individuals who have died are still listed on voter rolls. And just under 3 million individuals have registered in more than one state. Now, I do want to make a specific point that this is not an indication of voter fraud. This is an indication of a state voter registration system that isn't keeping pace with a mobile American society. Election officials don't have the tools to keep up when voters die, when voters move, when voters change their name. There hasn't been a great system, and we're getting better. But as you see in this research we did in 2012, there are all kinds of errors in state voter rolls. So in addition to the accuracy of voter records, that can lead to problems of completeness of state voter rolls. We want all eligible, but only eligible voters to be able to cast a ballot because they are accurately registered. Good voter registration list maintenance programs will not just remove ineligible voters, but will help ensure that eligible voters have a streamlined and accurate process to the ballot. It also is just better for administration of polling precincts, right? We're talking about printing out an appropriate number of ballots, hiring and making sure the right number of poll workers are assigned to each precinct, making sure that the right number of voting machines are assigned to each precinct. Clean voter lists give election officials the data and the information they need to properly plan for an election. That should result in fewer problems at the polls on election day. So here are just a few examples. When voters' records are accurate, you should have fewer voters needing to cast a provisional ballot. You should see a reduction in election day registration transactions. As those reduce, you should see shorter lines on election day. Now, provisional ballots and election day registration transactions are not negatives in and of themselves. Many people would say this is the system working appropriately. Voters are given the opportunity to show up and correct an error, and that's a good thing. But provisional ballots and election day registration transactions take longer to process, cost more money to process, and just require additional resources on election day for election officials, which result in longer lines and more problems for voters. So if we can reduce those, we're going to see a more streamlined election day. Accurate voter rolls are also going to reduce opportunities for fraud. When registrations are removed for ineligible voters, when registrations are corrected and voters are accurately listed, there simply will not be an opportunity for someone to show up to a polling place and pretend to be someone else. Now, we've seen data that is not really a high occurrence in this country, but it is key to reduce that opportunity. And clean voter rolls are the way to reduce opportunities for fraud. And finally, cost savings. As I mentioned earlier, a better administration of a polling precinct is going to result in less money spent on unnecessary resources, printing out too many ballots. It's also going to reduce the cost of mail. So many states or many local jurisdictions are sending voter registration cards and voter pamphlets to voters. If these resources are going to voters who have long since left the jurisdiction or have long since been eligible voters, it's simply a waste of resources that could be better allocated. So a good voter registration list maintenance program is going to really improve the entire election process. We often get caught up in a kind of binary discussion from the left and the right of integrity versus access. But a good voter registration list maintenance program and accurate voter rolls really remove that binary decision and are both going to streamline the voter registration process for eligible individuals while removing the opportunity for ineligible voters to participate. We want to make it easy to vote but hard to cheat. And that's not a binary decision anymore. So really what we're looking at as in 2016 is that the best defense is a great offense. Voter registration list maintenance should be an ongoing and continuous activity. What we want to move away from are these kind of one-time lump removal processes. And just as some anecdotal evidence, I'm in Washington, D.C. Several years ago. Washington, D.C. took a look at its rolls and just found that they were rife with deadwood. Specifically, after a list maintenance process, they removed about 90,000 individuals, just over. 9 out of 10 of those individuals were removed because the voter had died. Now that number seems eye-popping, and when news media here in D.C. found out, it became a story. It's not great when you have not done list maintenance in so long that you have to remove 90,000 people at one time, 9 to 10 out of them being deceased is not the right way, and it instills questions among the voting public and among election officials. Had DC been able to do voter registration list maintenance on a more continuous basis, they wouldn't have had such eye-popping and unusual numbers. So there are several tools to help keep voter registration rolls up to date and more accurate. And this is what I'm going to focus the rest of my short time with you guys today. First, online voter registration. So there are several benefits to online voter registration. First, it results in more accurate voter records. You're not deciphering sloppy handwriting on a paper form. There's no third-party data entry by election officials trying to decipher that handwriting. Online voter registration is a direct link between the voter and her record so that she can go online, find her record, and ensure that all of that information is up to date. When she moves, she can ensure that her address has been updated in her voter record. It's empowering the voter to take control of their record and really be able to remove duplicate information or inaccurate information. An online voter registration system compliant with state law could allow for online cancellations or at least direct voters to the right forms so that they can take charge and remove themselves where they are no longer eligible. One problem is that voters simply don't know how to get themselves off a voter roll on which they are no longer eligible if they've moved out of a town, a county, or the state entirely. So providing that information, even if it's not an online process, even if it's just a direct link to the right form, would be instrumental in helping voters take control and remove themselves where they are no longer eligible. Again, reduced opportunities for fraud as voter rolls become clearer, as there are not voter records that have inaccuracies in them, and again, cost savings compared to paper forms. So this is a quick map. The states you see in blue are states that have online voter registration right now. There are 32 counting Washington, D.C. The states you see in yellow have passed laws and are currently building online voter registration sites. I will also note Ohio and Michigan are kind of special cases. They're not colored in on your map, but they do allow for online updates to voter registration records. So if you are a new voter, you do have to fill out a paper form. But if you've moved within the state or if you've changed your name, actually I believe it's just residence related. So if you've moved within the state, you can go online and update your registration. So you can see a majority of the country, and that's both voters and states, now have online voter registration. This has been a pretty hot trend in election administration over the past few years. In 2008, there were only 2 states with online voter registration, and that was just Arizona and Washington. And obviously, it has been a very hot trend to move in the direction of taking paper forms out of the registration process for all those benefits I mentioned earlier. So another great tool is improving motor voter sources. So this is back to the NVRA, Section 5. I'm also going to kind of just include that new trend of automatic voter registration along with motor voter, because as we see it right now, the states that are passing bills titled automatic voter registration, or Oregon, who has already moved in that direction, it's really an expansion of motor voter. They're taking records in their motor vehicles files and making sure that those individuals are registered. So that's kind of the foundation for automatic voter registration as we're seeing it currently. So we put out a report, Pew put out a report called Measuring Motor Voter a couple years ago. I believe this report and some of the other reports I've mentioned are on the resources tab of the webinar. So if you want any of these, you can find them. We took a look. We took a look at motor voter, and we really want to know how well states are performing. I've talked quite a bit about making voter registration list maintenance an ongoing process. When citizens have a life event that would kind of necessitate an update in their voter registration record, one of the first places they go is the Motor Vehicles Agency. And that's what voter was always intended to do, catch citizens in those life events when they're occurring. If you can do that, you don't have to do that one-time lump list maintenance activity. Now, we did find that many states don't perform motor voter particularly well. So we made a couple of recommendations that you can see, particularly prioritizing the collection of data, increasing coordination between the election and DMV agencies, developing common strategies and terminology, specifically eliminating paper from the process. And again, the reason that all of these recommendations are going to improve election administration is because you're catching citizens when they need to do that voter registration update. Finally, the last is interstate election data sharing. This is a relatively new tool, and you're going to hear a lot about it from John Lindbeck, so I'm not really going to go into detail, but this is another tool that is being presented for state election officials to keep voter registration list maintenance going, to keep it up to date, and to really match well. What we're talking about is matching records in a secure environment so that election officials can really know in real time who their voters are and where they should be registered. And states are really seeing the benefit of engaging with each other to learn about who their voters are and where they should be registered. And really that's a quick overview of state voter registration policies, of the federal laws that govern, and some of the new tools that states are employing. I'm happy to answer any quick questions if there are any, or just let John jump into interstate election data sharing.
Thank you, Sam. We did have one question, and that's regarding the Help America Vote Act slide. Regarding point number 2, the state DMV official working with the Social Security Administration, the question was, should that, as opposed to the DMV official, should that be the state election official? Is that correct?
I believe that is correct. Let me, you know what? I've got the NVRA in front of me. If you want to, it'll take me a second to pull it up. I do believe that is what the language says, though, and I'm happy to come back a little later and confirm.
Okay, great. And you can also enter it into the chat box as well.
I'll do that.
Excellent. We did have one other quick question, which is there a system or program used among states to prevent duplication in voter registration?
I think that question leads really well into John's presentation. I'm not going to steal his thunder.
Well, with that, we'll turn it over to you, John. This is John Lindbeck from the Electronic Registration Information Center.
Morning, everybody, and thanks to NCSL for providing me the opportunity to talk about ERIC. As has been discussed earlier in this webinar, ERIC is a tool by which states can use to improve the accuracy of their voter registration list and also reach out to voters who are not registered to vote and provide them with information on how to register. ERIC was first formed in 2012, and its mission is to assist the states to improve the accuracy of the rolls, to reduce costs, and improve the efficiency of state and local elections offices. We were recommended quite highly by the recent Presidential Commission report. Some of you may remember the President's Commission on Elections Administration that was appointed to look at the reason for long lines in some of the polling places in the 2012 election. That commission was chaired by the counsels to the two presidential campaigns, President Barack Obama's campaign and Mitt Romney's campaign, and was included officials from the private sector as well as state elections officials. And one of the recommendations that they made quite prominently was that states should engage in interstate data sharing in order to improve the accuracy of their voter list. They recognized that a state's voter registration list and the quality of that voter registration list is the bedrock for any election. And if you have a messy voter registration list, things are not going to go as well. is if you have a clean list. And a clean list meaning that everything for each voter is accurate, and that you don't have individuals still on the list who shouldn't be there for various reasons. The quality of the list can affect the ability of people to vote. If they show up at a polling place and it's the wrong polling place, they've moved, their registration is old, it can affect their ability to vote. Sometimes in some states they can't vote at all. In other states only part of their ballot will count. And it can significantly slow down the processing of voters at polling places and resulting in long lines. So let's talk about ERIC. ERIC was formed in 2012 with 7 what I call pioneer states. It's run by the states themselves. It is a nonprofit organization owned by those states and governed by those states. We currently have 15 states in the District of Columbia as members. They operate under the terms of a membership agreement, and a copy of the bylaws and the membership agreement are on the page here on this webinar. It's easy for you to download. We have 2 full-time employees. Myself, I serve as the executive director of ERIC. Our other employee is Erica Haas, who has great technical expertise in data matching, and she assists our states with onboarding into ERIC, getting their data uploaded, producing the reports that go back to the states that shows and identifies records that are out of date and inaccurate. The states routinely upload their data every 60 days to ERIC. At a minimum, our states are required to upload their voter registration data and their Department of Motor Vehicles data, those people that hold driver's licenses and or state-issued identification. We are at all times recruiting new members to join ERIC, and the next slide will give you an idea of exactly how that's been going. Here are the 7 pioneering states. This is where we started in 2012 with Washington, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. And this is what the map looks like now. And we have different categories here. The states in green are all now members of ERIC, so that you can see we've added states like Pennsylvania and Illinois and Alabama and Louisiana, Oregon. In the orange are states that have indicated to us their intent to join as quickly as possible. Those would be West Virginia, Alaska, Wisconsin, and Montana. In the red, we have states that have adopted legislation that enables them to join ERIC. They have not joined yet, and the reasons for not joining yet are many and varied, and I won't try to go into all of them now. But when they are ready to join, the legislation is there, the authorization is there. In blue, we have states such as California, Hawaii, and Massachusetts who have legislation pending. If a state is in white, that does not mean that there is not interest in joining ERIC. For example, we have strong support that has been voiced among local officials in Florida for joining ERIC, and they're encouraging the legislature and the Secretary of State there to adopt legislation for authorization. I've been having conversations in the past few days with a state like Michigan that's also very interested in joining ERIC. And so there are lots of questions being asked. The trend lines are all moving in the right direction. We have slow and steady growth, which is good because if everybody decided they wanted to vote tomorrow with just if everyone decided they wanted to join ERIC tomorrow with just 2 employees, that probably wouldn't work so great. So it's just fine with us that states are coming on in a methodical fashion here. And also, I like to brag a little bit that map about online registration is impressive. It shows a lot of states have implemented online voter registration, but I can make a an argument here that in terms of a new trend for elections, that the ERIC trend lines are moving faster even than voter registration. We got a later start, but states are coming on at a little faster pace. So let me talk about the information that states get from ERIC. ERIC uses state-of-the-art, highly sophisticated data matching software obtained through IBM, and originally developed for purposes such as Homeland Security. Each state, as I indicated earlier, submits a minimum of their voter data and their Department of Motor Vehicles data. We match that data against other sources as well, including the Social Security Administration's Death Index. We have almost 90 million Social Security Administration Death Index records loaded into ERIC. And we recently have implemented the use of National Change of Address data from the U.S. Post Office. So all that data gets mixed and matched in order to help determine whether or not a state's voter registration record, each record in the database is accurate or whether it needs updating. The reports that we send back to our member states fall into two categories. One, outreach, and the other, list maintenance. The outreach is we are able to tell our states by matching DMV records against state voter registration records, we're able to give them a list of people from the DMV who are not yet registered to vote. Under the terms of the ERIC membership agreement, they are required to reach out to those people with information on how to register. On the list maintenance side, we are able to identify for our states people who have moved within a state, people have moved to other ERIC states, that's the cross-state movers, individuals who have died, and also a category called in-state duplicates. Those are people who haven't necessarily moved, but for one reason or another, they have a duplicate registration. There's more than one in the system for them, and it's the same person. The most common reason for this, for in-state duplicates, is change of name. When people get married, women get married, their name changes, and they register under a new name, and that old registration sometimes hangs around. So let's talk about the list maintenance side. How do we identify in-state movers? We do that by matching a DMV record or a national change of address record from the post office, and identify that in that record there's a newer address for that voter, and so we inform the elections official of that newer address. For cross-state movers, we're able to identify for the election official that a voter has a newer address on a voter registration list in another state, or a DMV in another state, or through the national change of address information. For deceased, we're able to identify those folks by a match to the Social Security Death Master List, as I indicated earlier. And for in-state duplicates, we're able to identify that because our matching software is sophisticated enough to be able to determine that this is the same person. One of our more interesting examples of that was that we recently had a state that was convinced that they had a false positive on a duplicate, and that the ERIC information must be wrong, and they looked into it, and it turned out that the ERIC information was right because these two registrations were for the same person, but it was a transgendered person. And so on the surface, it looked like it was these were two different individuals, but ERIC was able to determine that no, it was the same person. So we recommend that that states do this list maintenance and receive these reports as often as they can, though they're often restricted in the timing by elections themselves, because the federal election law puts in windows by which you're not allowed to change your voter registration. We recommend to our states that they download this information as often as possible. We only send our states a match once. They will not get matches over and over again, and that's included with the potentially eligible but unregistered list. Possible actions are to send postcards to the old address and act on an undeliverable, ask for a voluntary cancellation and send out a notice, and provide notice and inactivation if there is no response. And also there may be state laws that enter into how states use this data. Under no circumstances does a state's membership in ERIC affect what they're required to do under the NVRA in terms of notice. The NVRA is still the law of the land in this regard, and so you'll find that the membership agreement requires our members to send out notices for these different list maintenance reports that an individual who's identified as having an old address and that you have a newer address for them, that you send out a notice to those people. In terms of the outreach to the potentially eligible but unregistered, we arrive at that by comparing a DMV list against the voter registration list. The voters are a smaller subset of that list, and we're able to tell our states which people are here, and this is what we call a non-match situation. They appeared only on the DMV list, and they did not appear on the voter registration list. At a minimum, the membership requirement, the membership agreement requires the states to do this report every 2 years. They are required to contact the voters within 90 days of receiving the data. ERIC includes this name only once, unless they change address again. And the DMV information is excluded when matching an active or inactive voter. So I'd like to give you some statistics of how it's gone so far in terms of what we've been able to report to our member states so far. So as of this month, if you look to the far right under total records sent, we have identified almost 2.8 million records to our member states of folks that have moved within their state. We've identified 623,000 cross-state movers. We've identified 150,000 people who are on the rolls of our member states and who are deceased. And we've identified almost 55,000 duplicate registrations. One of the interesting things to me when I look at these numbers is the most high-profile reason often cited for a state to join ERIC is cross-state movers. That you should join ERIC because we need to track these people that are moving from state to state and get rid of their old registration. That's obviously a very, very important reason to join ERIC. But what's turning out to be, in terms of the numbers, an even more important reason to join ERIC are the in-state movers. When someone moves, they're much more likely to move in-state than they are to move out of state. And so, and that in-state mover, the record for that in-state mover is just as inaccurate as the record for that out-of-state mover, and it creates all of the same problems that it does for out-of-state movers. So, when I give presentations on ERIC, I like to emphasize the value of the matching on in-state movers and how important that is, because it's much more likely that when someone moves, they're going to move within their state. So far, we've sent out 11.7 million names and addresses to our member states of folks who are potentially eligible to vote but unregistered, so that they can receive information on how to register. And there'll be another big round of that this year, of course, with the elections. They're required to do that once every 2 years. Some of our states are doing it much more often than that. Some of them are waiting and doing it before the big federal general elections. We have some new states, some large new states that have joined ERIC, such as Pennsylvania, who will be doing it for the first time. This is a little a chart that sort of shows you how the flow of data works. The state submits their data, voter and DMV data here. The most sensitive fields in the data, such as the last 4 digits of the Social Security number or the birth date of the voter, are anonymized before they leave state control. That means that we issue the state an anonymizer program, and those fields are transformed into a set of roughly 30 to 40 characters and letters and numbers, and then that's transferred to ERIC. And so when ERIC receives this data, the most sensitive fields are in non-human readable form. But because each state is using the same anonymizer program, we're able to match anonymized data against anonymized data. And when those reports go back to the states, we're able to identify that, for example, that if I move to Washington, I live in Oregon, that if I move to Washington, that the last 4 digits of the Social Security number matched, but the states don't need to know, and the report doesn't need to state what the Social Security number was. They just need to know that it was a match, because they already have that information within their own databases. So that's one of our security measures that we like to talk about, is that these sensitive fields are anonymized before they ever leave a state's control. They arrive at ERIC. Erica Haas, our technical employee, works with the states to make sure that that data is in shape for uploading into the database, and she anonymizes that data a second time, and then it for good security practice, it then moves into the ERIC Nosphere matching process. That's the name of our software. We turn out reports, and they go back out to the states, and the states are able to download them and use them. So we're seeing cost savings with ERIC in some of our states. Some of the early results are looking very good. For example, if your state or your local election officials are already purchasing MCOA data or the Social Security death list, our members now receive that through their membership in ERIC. King County, Washington has been reporting a 1/3 reduction in non-deliverable ballots in the wake of Washington joining ERIC. Minnesota has also seen savings in regards to fewer election day registrations, which is the big one. Minnesota is an election day registration state. And for folks that have same-day registration, what you find is when you implement same-day registration, people tend to wait to update their registrations until they go to the polls on election day. It's human nature. And it saves money for the state to have less of that activity on election day, and Minnesota is already seeing that. So we have a set of bylaws and a membership agreement, as I indicated earlier. Here are some of the terms. I won't read them all to you. but the bylaws and membership agreement are available for downloading on the website for this webinar. And I'll stop here. This is the contact information for both myself and Erica Haas. Our website is www.ericstates.org, and here's my cell number if you'd like to call me and ask me any questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation, John. I think that was really helpful. We do have a few questions, but for the sake of time, I think we should move to our next speaker, and then we can revisit those questions at the end. So now I'll turn it over to Wendy Underhill of NCSL.
Well, thank you, Dan. Sam and John, I want to thank you also. I learned quite a lot from both of you today, and I'm somebody who's seen your slides before, so it's interesting how I could still get a new set of information from it. To everyone else who's out there, I know that Sam from Pew and John from ERIC are both willing to talk with anybody more or less any time who wants to learn more about their work in regard to list maintenance, and their information will be available to you at the end. So either send an email to us or to them after the webinar, put a note in the chat box, and we'll get you what you need. So when I was preparing for this webinar, I was struck by how similar from a legislative perspective list maintenance is to online voter registration. And what I mean by that is that in the last couple of years, we've been referring to online voter registration as the bipartisan trend in election administration. Well, it turns out Democrats and Republicans all have a stake in how accurate voter rolls are too. So this is also not a one-party issue by any means. And I guess I'd say that's because everybody wants to avoid headlines that say XYZ county's voter rolls larger than total population. And then we've heard from Sam in particular that the voter list is the first step in good election administration. Without those clean lists, voting is harder for the people, and it's also harder for the administrators on election day. There is one way, though, that I'd say that list maintenance is different than online voter registration, and that is that online voter registration is sort of a yes-no question. Shall we adopt it? Shall we not adopt it? But with list maintenance, there's so many different approaches that could be taken. So to find out what approaches legislators can consider, I thought we'd look at what legislators in other states have already considered and look at some information about list maintenance bills. We'll start with a map. This map represents bills that have been enacted since 2013. That doesn't mean states weren't doing bills relating to list maintenance prior, but we had to start somewhere. And the blue states have enacted legislation. The yellow states we are looking at to see whether pending legislation that we'll talk about today gets adopted or not. And I guess one of the messages I get when I look at this map is that list maintenance is on the minds of people everywhere, east, west, south, north, and Republican and Democratic states. So let me find my little cursor again here, move on. So we've heard a little bit about the national change of address, and while it's really great that ERIC can offer this in its big package for the states that participate, it's also true that states are sometimes doing it on their own. For instance, Oklahoma authorized the use of NCOA data to clean up its voter rolls just last year. Interesting to note that the bill passed out of both committees in both chambers with unanimous yes votes on it. And then Colorado, which is one of the pioneer states for ERIC, also went a step further this year. Its new law permits the records of a voter to be updated automatically according to NCOA data if that person is moving within the state. And the sponsor of that bill, Representative Kim Ransom, sees this as an efficiency measure. She said, "I'm pleased my colleagues in the House agreed to help ensure that we are using Colorado taxpayer dollars efficiently by streamlining the election list maintenance procedures." Now, we've already heard quite a bit today about the DMV, and that probably is the very best place to look for up-to-date information on voters, because as we've seen, people are more likely to get a new license than they are to contact their local election officials to update their voter registration. And this, too, can be handled through a system such as ERIC, but we'll look at a few DMV-related enactments, again, starting with Colorado. In 2015, the legislature here in Colorado enacted a bill that permits the Secretary of State's office to forward any information that it obtains from Colorado's motor vehicle agency to the county clerk so they can update their voter registration records. And then there's Delaware, and Delaware is the state that's usually credited with starting the trend towards linking the DMV and the voter registration system. And in 2014, the legislature enacted a bill to automatically change the voter registration address when a person changes their address at a DMV. The way I think of that is that the voter takes one action and they get two results out of that. And then I know we have Lena from West Virginia on the line here today, and West Virginia has enacted a bill that did quite a few things this year, and one of them was establishing automatic registration. And when we use that word, we mean that people doing business at the DMV in West Virginia will be automatically registered to vote unless they actively decide to opt out of that. And I'd like to point out that was part of a larger bill that also established a voter ID requirement. So then proof of citizenship. We all know that it is a requirement to be a citizen if you're going to vote in federal elections, but what can states do to check on that? Well, one thing they can do is to look at jury lists, and I'll use Kansas as a for instance here. It passed a law in 2013 to, in fact, use jury lists for list maintenance. So yesterday I went to Kansas's state election director, Brian Caskey, and asked him how it works, and I think he's on the line with us too today, so I'm reading very words, Brian. Every month, each district court clerk, and there are 31, send me a list of persons who were called for jury duty and stated that they were not United States citizens on the jury questionnaire. We then review those lists with our statewide voter registration database. When a potential match is discovered, we do not automatically remove the person from the voter registration list. We contact the registered voter and ask them to verify their status or if they want to remove themselves from the voter registration list. And Louisiana did something similar as well. And Montana sort of did the reverse, where it was suggesting that jury pools be drawn only from lists of active registered voters. That way, what they'd realized is that the inactive list of voters included a lot of people who'd in fact moved out of state. Now, we've talked a little bit about death records, and we all know probably that one of the big myths about elections is that people are voting from beyond the grave. And it is difficult for election officials to keep up to date on their voters. And I know that many local election officials actually read the obituaries to get information about their voting population. But there are easier ways to do it, some of which we've heard about. And one is to check with the Social Security Administration, known as the SSA. This service, of course, is included in the data matching done by ERIC, but it is something states can do independently as well. And in fact, in 2014, Maryland enacted a bill to require the use of reports from the SSA to start the process of removing deceased voters from its statewide list. And in Arizona, just this year, there was legislation passed to require a transfer of death records information within the state. That would be from the Department of Health Services to the Secretary of State. And of course, in-state death records are a natural place to look for information. So if your state isn't yet doing that, that might be something to consider. Then I've got a couple of other ideas for you, came from a couple of other states. One is Rhode Island, and last year it had a bill to authorize an absentee ballot request to serve as an affirmation of address for inactive voters. With Rhode Island's new law, if someone has been put on the inactive list and then they request an absentee ballot, that puts them right back on the active list, and it also confirms the address. And then there's the question of people being on two states' lists, and we heard about that, and that too, Eric can look for those duplicates. But we know that most voters don't bother when they move to notify their previous election officials. And in fact, my own daughters, I mean, they live in a household, or they lived in a household with somebody who cares a lot about elections. They didn't automatically update their records when they moved. So what that means is that many people are indeed on the voter rolls in two states at the same time, the state that they moved from and the state that they moved to. And I don't believe it's illegal to be on two lists, but you can see how being on two lists is wasteful, and also how it could lead to voting in two states. This year, a legislator in New Jersey introduced a bill that would require the Secretary of State there to work with election officials in other states to eliminate those duplicate records. And the sponsor, Assemblyman Michael Carroll, wrote, "In our increasingly mobile society, many people already split their time between multiple jurisdictions. Think snowbird. Unfortunately, some of these people consider multiple residences as an invitation for repeat voting." And so his bill is meant to control that. And Virginia enacted a similar bill last year as well. So we talked a lot about the interstate data sharing, and I won't say much more. We did have a question from Rachel Weiss about whether it's required to have legislation to engage in this, and the answer is it depends on your state and how your laws are written, and we can give you more details on that if you'd like. I do want to mention, actually I shouldn't have quite moved quite so quickly. I do want to mention that there's been written into quite a few pieces of legislation recently the words interstate cross-check, and that brings up another system called the Interstate Voter Registration Cross-Check Program, otherwise known as the Kansas Project. And this is a group of 30 states that do exchange their voter rolls in the spring of even-numbered years. And the contact person for that is Brian Caskey, and I will put his information in the chat box. So I am going to wrap up here, so we've got time for at least a couple of questions. It seems like if you or your legislators are interested in doing something to clean up election rolls, one way to do it is to go visit at your state election official's office or even local election official's office. And here are 3 questions that you might want to use to get a conversation started. I won't read them. You can all read that. And another option other than that would be to connect your legislators with John Lindback from ERIC or Sam Dearheimer from Pew, or with us, of course. That's our job here, is to assist legislators and legislative staff. I'm going to stop talking. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much, Wendy. We'll now move on to questions because we have just about 6 minutes left in the webinar. First, I just want to say, as a reminder, NCSL will be having its annual legislative summit this year, August 8th to the 11th in Chicago, Illinois. There will be a full slate of redistricting and elections programming, so we encourage everyone to sign up for the summit. And now we'll move on to questions. First, I want to pose the question of data security. We've had a few questions asking about the security of DMV data, specifically from Oregon, and Oregon having that database hacked several times, as well as the security of ERIC data. Specifically for, just going to bring up Matt Gary's questions here. Are there security requirements for the states that participate in ERIC? Are states restricted to the use of ERIC data only for elections and voter registration purposes?
This is John Lindback. The ERIC membership agreement that each state signs says that they will only use ERIC reports, the data they get back from us, for voter registration purposes. And it's not unusual when states are considering joining ERIC for them to ask lots of security questions. Some states want more detail than others. But what we have done in the case of a couple of states, and I think, Matt, you were asking specifically about Minnesota. Minnesota was one state that wanted more information than most, and so we were able to sign non-disclosure agreements with the state personnel, and we're able to open up ERIC's entire security apparatus for them to take a look. It was a useful exercise on all sides. The DMV from the state of Illinois also asked for something very similar. Again, if personnel from the states can sign non-disclosure agreements, we can provide them with the nitty-gritty details on how we keep this data secure. We also have some details, of course, that we can discuss in public. The reason we can't discuss everything in public is that if you lay out your entire security apparatus, then it damages the security. So we take great lengths to keep this data secure, and many of our states are left with the conclusion after looking at how we go about things that we are doing things to keep data secure that they are not, and have found it a valuable byproduct of membership in ERIC that they can take some of these security procedures back to their home states and employ them there.
Great, thanks, John. If you were starting from a blank slate, what specific standards would you recommend for database matching?
Boy, that's that's a question that would involve a lot more time than we have here. But obviously, it needs to be as secure as possible. You also need identifying information such as birth dates and the last 4 digits of Social Security in order to ensure that a match is correct. Without information like that, you end up with higher false positives. I noticed there was a question about how many false positives do we get, and we get very few complaints. I can't give you statistics on that, in part because we get so few complaints about it from our member states, that the false positive rate is extremely low. One area where we do have some false positives is in this eligible but unregistered list that we hand out to states. There are going to be people on that initial list that are registered to vote, but because of the matching, they're missed. And one of the reasons for that is that there is information that's incorrect in one database or the other. Most often, the birth date is listed incorrectly in the state voter registration list. And it's easy to understand how that happens because in most jurisdictions that information is entered by hand off of a handwritten voter registration form.
John, this is Dan. I'm sorry to interrupt you here. We have about 1 minute left, and so I did. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut you off there. If there are other questions, you have our contact information on the screen. Please feel free to send any or all of us an email, and we would be happy to follow up with you on that. And with that, I do want to thank everyone for their time and attention today. The webinar will be archived within 1 week, and you can go to ncsl.org/wires to access all of our webinar archives, as well as see additional election resources. And with that, I'm going to conclude the webinar. I hope everyone has a great weekend and for your attention.